So in this section, we're going to take a look at the different types of muscles, the 3 different types. Think back to histology. That was your favorite section, right? So contraction works the same for both smooth and skeletal muscles, but the structure and function of them is going to be different. They are shorter, longer, have a single nuclei, or they're multinucleate. Smooth muscle lacks transverse tubules and striations, okay? So compared to skeletal muscle fibers, they're shorter. They have a single centrally located nucleus. They have longer ends. Not having striations is why we call them smooth. They contract more slowly and relax more slowly. Their myofilaments are not organized. They're random, all right? And so importantly, they lack those definite striations, okay? Smooth muscle can be broken down into 2 different types, multi-unit and visceral. Multi-unit smooth muscle is not very organized. They function independently of each other. They're found in areas like the iris of the eyes or certain types of large blood vessels, and they only contract after stimulation. Visceral smooth muscle fibers more commonly respond as a single unit. If one fiber is stimulated, the impulse is transmitted to the adjacent cells. This causes a rhythmic repeated contraction. And this is what causes that wave-like peristalsis that occurs in our intestines, that moves contents along a tube like that intestines or in the ureters in order to move urine. You will find this also in the walls of most hollow organs. So how is smooth muscle contraction similar or different from skeletal muscle? It's similar in that both have action potentials, calcium ions, ATP, actin, and myosin. The action, however, is different. Smooth muscle has calmodulin and not troponin, so it has a little bit different substance there. It's going to bind, the calmodulin is going to bind to the calcium ions directly and activate the contraction and is going to contract slower. Calcium ions also can diffuse from the extracellular matrix. Acetylcholine and norepinephrine affect smooth muscle. These neurotransmitters stimulate contraction in some smooth muscles, but they can actually inhibit them in others. We've got hormones like oxytocin can also cause contraction. And oxytocin is what causes the uterus to contract. In organs like the bladder or intestines, we actually have stretch receptors that can trigger contractions as well. These are also, smooth muscle are a little slower to contract and relax. I think I already said that. They're more resistant to fatigue, and they're able to change length without changing tautness or how well they're holding. Cardiac muscle, we know, is only found in the heart. They are single nucleate. They have lots of actin and myosin, striated, of course, and they store less calcium, but their tubules are larger, and so they can release more calcium ions. Calcium comes from the extracellular fluid as it acts as a control for the strength and length of a contraction. These contain, remember, those intercalated discs, and those are these little hard to see lines, but you can see they're there. They're kind of little squiggly lines. Those are intercalated discs, and those are a type of membrane junctions, remember, that allow contraction to occur simultaneously throughout the heart's surface, so that allows a single contraction. We don't want that to be an uneven contraction. Remember, the action potentials have to be all or none with a threshold amount of stimulation to make the muscle contract, and it will contract fully or it's going to contract not at all. Cardiac muscle also has that refractory period, which is the period where you cannot send another contraction until the other one stops, and that's important. Remember, it is also self-exciting. It does not need nervous cell stimulation, and you should not have sustained or tetanic contractions. This is just a good summary that you can use to study the characteristics of the 3 different types of muscles. Skeletal muscles give us a great variety of body movements. The action of each of those depends on the type of joint it is associated with and how the muscle is attached to that joint. Whenever limbs or other body parts move, the bones and muscles interact basically as a simple mechanical device. They act as a lever. And so a lever has 4 basic components. You have a rigid bar, and that is where our bones come in. You have a fulcrum, which is what allows the bar to pivot or move. That would be our joint. And then you have an object, which is moved against resistance, and that's going to be weight of some sort. And then you have a force that supplies energy to move the bar, and that is our muscles. Okay. So here on the right, you can see a pair of scissors can act as a lever. The handle and the blade form a rigid bar that rocks on a fulcrum in the center, and that fulcrum is the screw. The material cut, an example there would be the resistance. You supply the force when you squeeze the handles. This is a first-class lever: resistance, fulcrum, and force. The types of levers differ kind of by the way that they are arranged. Bending and straightening the upper limb at the elbow is going to illustrate here for us how bones and muscles act as levers. When the upper limb bends, as in this picture here at the top, as it's bending, the forearm is like the rigid bar, and the elbow is like the fulcrum. And you can see that down here. It's like the fulcrum there. The hand is moved against the resistance of the weight, and the force is supplied by the muscles on the anterior side of the arm. Levers provide a range of movements, right? They move limbs, for example, produce rapid motions, whereas others, such as those that move the head, help maintain posture without very much effort. So in lab, you're going to be given information about the origin and insertion, and I believe we touched on this a little bit, but we're going to talk about it briefly again. Origin, remember, is the immovable end, and insertion is the movable end, okay? And so you can see here, you've got the origin of the biceps brachii here that's attached to the coracoid process, and the insertion of the biceps brachii here that's attached to this part here of the radius, right? And so it has 2 heads that originate on the scapula, basically. And okay, so you have the long head here and the short head here. And the tendon inserts this muscle on the radius. So we talked just a little bit in lab, or we study a little bit in lab about the role particular muscles play in body movements. And you can determine those roles by carefully observing body movements. For instance, contracting the deltoid muscle causes abduction of the arm. A muscle that causes an action is called an agonist for that action. And so the deltoid is an agonist for abduction of the arm. While an agonist is acting, other nearby muscles may also contract to help with the action. So, for example, if the deltoid abducts the arm, the supraspinatus is a muscle that originates on the scapula, and that is going to help with the abduction. Muscles that work together like this are called synergist. They work together. In some cases, the abduction of the arm by the deltoid is an example. One of the agonists is doing most of the work. And in such a case, the agonist might be called the prime mover because it is doing most of the work. Other muscles can act as antagonists, okay? And so you probably realize antagonist is going to mean the opposite. So they work to oppose the action. So muscles kind of work in pairs. These muscles can cause movement in the opposite direction. The antagonist of muscles that raise the upper limb can lower the upper limb, or the antagonist of the muscles that bend the upper arm could straighten it. So how do our muscles change throughout life? Well, signs of aging in muscle begins in your 40s, which is pretty early. Supplies molecules that are needed for muscle function start to decline. Things like myoglobin, ATP, creatine phosphate. Muscle atrophy progresses with aging, and that's caused by the reduction in those molecules and also the size of the muscle fibers. So exercise is important to help maintain muscle mass and function, to keep those muscles moving, to keep those muscles built up.